Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's class on empowering your plate, harnessing meal planning tech for intuitive eating. I am so excited to have Allison here with us presenting today on this topic. My name is Evita, and I'm the registered dietitian from That Clean Life. I'm going to let Allison introduce herself in just a moment, but before I do that, I want to say a big thank you to everyone for coming out here today live, or if you're watching the replay. And I am so honored to have Allison come present with us today. Allison really knows and understands that everyone has a right to feel safe and at home in their bodies, and that's why she's invested so much time and training in learning how to support nutrition in clients who have experienced trauma. Allison is a co-founder of Nutrition Hive and a co-founder and supervisor at Clinicians Incubator. And she's just a wealth of wisdom. So I'll let Allison take it over without further ado, and talk about harnessing meal planning tech for intuitive eating.
Thank you so much, Avita. And also just big thank you to That Clean Life and Practice Better for collaborating on this webinar. I'm so excited to talk about one of my favorite topics. And I love seeing in the chat some folks that are familiar names, and also hello to all the West Coast Californians. I'm coming at you from Los Angeles myself. And as Avita mentioned, I am a co-founder of the National Practice Nutrition Hive, where we combine functional medicine as well as our knowledge about eating behavior to provide personalized nutrition care. And I'm also one of the co-founders and a supervisor over at Clinicians Incubator, where we provide CNS candidate supervision so that they are ready to sit for their board exam and get their CNS credential. One of our other projects under Clinicians Incubator is Nested Health Coaching. It's a special health coaching program that's just for clinicians. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about today are more coaching and counseling skills, and we're keeping it within scope of practice for nutrition professionals. So I hope we have some fun and we just load you up with some more skills that you can use with your clients and learn how to combine that with all of your fun tools that you can use in That Clean Life. So here are the learning objectives for today. The theme is striving for dietary variety and flexibility. And we're also going to work on how we can help our clients build some distress tolerance when we're talking about how they're going to acquire and prepare food. And we're going to start looking at how we can use things like That Clean Life or Practice Better or other similar tools that can help you with facilitating food exposure projects with your clients. And that really going to help empower your clients. And generally, whether you work with the eating disorder population, the disordered eating population, and also I think this really applies if you work with the GI population or any kind of population where maybe they have autoimmune or chronic inflammatory diseases, and you've had to remove food and bring the food back in. Anytime we're bringing a food back in to a client's life, these are tools and skills we can use. So if you feel like, I'm just curious about this, but I really work just in GI or I really work in just autoimmune nutrition, this is all still going to be applicable to the work that you do. So I would love to just, if anyone could drop in the chat, does anybody predominantly work with the disordered eating or eating disorder population? Can you drop a cheers in the chat or a hi, yes, that's me in the chat? Anybody work with that population? Awesome. Nice to see you all. Oh yes, for kiddos, yeah. And anybody work predominantly in GI? Anybody identify as a GI nutrition specialist? Oh, awesome, Carolyn. What a great reflection. Oh, this is so helpful to know. Great. Okay. That really helps me know. Awesome gut health. Yeah. So we'll make sure that we are talking about that today as we go through the slides, because I want to make sure that this is still relevant for everybody on the call. Oh, fabulous. Welcome. Okay. So what types of clients is this for? This is for when we're working with clients in predominantly an outpatient setting. So predominantly in a one-on-one personalized outpatient setting. And if we're talking about those GI, those chronic inflammatory autoimmune kind of clients, this is typically kind of the skills that you're going to use after you've done a ton, all that really like roll up the sleeves therapeutic work with the client. And we're going to bring foods back in and see how the client does. If you work predominantly with the disordered eating disorder population, this is going to be at the time in the process where you've probably introduced intuitive eating. We're a little bit further along in recovery, and the client is ready to go. They're at a stage of change where they're ready to start talking about, we might want to explore more flexibility. And sometimes we might drip these tools in a little bit earlier, but as we'll talk about, it's always going to be a collaborative process with the client. And so we're going to use a trauma-informed approach to make sure that we're staying client-centered. So if intuitive eating is new to you, I encourage you to go to the source, the authors of intuitive eating. They now have 4 editions of the book. Most recent came out in 2020. It's rooted in elements of cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's very much rooted in mindfulness-based approaches. There are 10 principles, and at the core of that work is we're helping clients connect to body cue attunement. And sometimes that means embracing a rejection of a diet mentality. And a lot of times we're striving towards acceptance of one's body. And we're trying to regain trust with food. And you might have thought, well, I work with GI. What does this have to do with GI? Well, gosh, I don't know about you. If you have a food that feels like it has betrayed you, we have to rebuild trust with that food. So I really see this as a beautiful Venn diagram with all of us and all of the work that we do. I just threw in a few interesting statistics in case you're, again, new to intuitive eating, or if you wanted to hear a little bit more about some recent research. And we're finding that in the literature, intuitive eating is actually showing that it's not just helping people feel better about their relationship to food, it's also improving some biomarkers in a way that's really positive, even when compared to a control group where they're being given more prescriptive recommendations that in theory would also improve those biomarkers, which is super interesting. So if you want to read more some research about how intuitive eating might also improve biomarkers, especially for those of you who span the functional nutrition kind of school of thought the way our practice does, I think it's always helpful to look at those studies as well. So the theme, the spirit of this work is we're trying to regain trust with food and rebuild body attunement. And a lot of times, sometimes, thinking about meal planning and structure feels like that might be a little bit like oil and vinegar. And we're going to just talk through that and see how we might be able to slowly take steps towards embracing some of those tools, because I look at them as skills that we're helping our clients build over time. And there's elements of structure that can be really helpful, and it's something that's going to be different for every client. And we're going to go through and talk about how we can really personalize that for each client. So some common, I think, eating disorder and disordered eating kind of recovery sticky points. And I think this also applies especially to GI and autoimmune populations as well. How many of you probably see your clients potentially eating the same meals from the same source over and over again because those foods feel safe? We love it when our clients are, eating enough and it's technically adequate. And if we crunch the numbers, we're like, okay, we're doing our job. They're meeting their needs. But it might be getting a little monotonous and it's lacking variety. And that sometimes can have its own impact on the microbiome. And it also can have an impact on just some freedom and flexibility a client might feel and their ability to eat socially. Sometimes we also see that even if the client's really done a lot of work on recovery, there's still some kind of avoidance happening with fear foods, or potentially avoidance even with making something. I had a client who was extremely intimidated by making rice, by just steaming rice. That was really tough. And we spent a lot of time on preparing them for that process. And so we'll be talking through how we can take a look at that. And sometimes we can see that recovery process being hindered by some of those meal acquisition and just kind of the meal prep skills. So we're going to talk through how to do that. And a lot of times, I think it's so important that we honor as clinicians that the root cause of potentially the eating disorder, the disordered eating, or potentially the behaviors that we're seeing at this stage in their health journey are potentially rooted in a source of trauma. We're going to briefly just cover what is a trauma-informed approach so that we have a common language for the rest of this call. So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration defines trauma. They refer to it as the 3 E's. It's an event or a series of events that someone experiences that has an adverse effect. So event that is experienced and has an adverse effect. And it also can be something that potentially one person experiences and it doesn't necessarily have an adverse effect, but as long as it has an adverse effect on that individual, that can be considered trauma, and it's impacting someone's functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And when we start taking a look at how we as clinicians can provide a trauma-informed approach, especially if you work in the disordered eating disorder space, or the weight-inclusive healthcare space, we can look at the 6 guiding principles of trauma-informed care. Those are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, empowerment, voice, and choice, acknowledgement of cultural, historical, and gender issues, collaboration, and peer support. And what you see on the screen are those 6 guiding principles, and informed by a paper that came out last year about how to potentially incorporate those principles through that trauma-informed lens for weight-inclusive care, which can be particularly helpful for clients of various sizes and various different identities. And again, these are going to be themes that we use as we start talking about how do we then bring that into food exposures, and then the next kind of level in the video game of recovery, meal planning and preparing food. So when we start thinking about how can we use that trauma-informed approach, it shifts. So I remember when I was in graduate school and learning how to chart, there was a section on the note that referred to how we would monitor compliance. And that always kind of sat a little funky with me. And I realized at a certain point, especially after I did more training about working with the population who's in recovery, that compliance is such a sticky word, and labeling a client as non-compliant, it sometimes can make sort of like make all the other options of what's going on for this client disappear. We've just put a label on them. And when we start shifting our lens to a trauma-informed lens, and trying to think about where the behavior is coming from so we can understand it, bring curiosity to it alongside the client. Sometimes non-compliance shifts to, oh, the client is being protective of their past. The client's being protective potentially of their eating disorder, because sometimes when a client refuses to, embrace change or is scared of change, that's because rigidity saved them in the past. Again, I think this is also true for some of those GI or autoimmune clients too, where sticking to a therapeutic diet felt like it was the thing that saved them, that protected them. That can be a trauma response. And so honoring that this process of trying new foods is going to take some time, and incorporating those 6 principles of trauma-informed care throughout the process is going to be really helpful. A classic one, that client who just like won't make the recipes that we recommended. We spent all this time making this gorgeous recipe packet. And like, we love talking about food. I would assume you all love talking about food, because I know I love talking about food. That's what I do all day long. That client might be afraid to make your favorite recipe because they've just never had the privilege or a safe space to learn how to cook, or how to make a mistake while cooking. Like, burning things happens, that's okay. And so part of this process is making that safe for the client. So we're going to honor that root cause of what's going on with the client's relationship to potentially trying a new food or a new cooking technique while we're working with them. So one of the skills that we teach in the Nested Health Coaching program is the Yoda rule. And the Yoda rule is you are the guide. You are not Luke Skywalker. You're Yoda. And we are not there to be the hero. We are not there to be the one who's experiencing the journey. We are Yoda. We are their guide. And so our job is often to ask questions so the hero can then figure out their own journey, their own story. And we're going to look at some of those questions to ask today. So I'm assuming most folks on the call have some training in motivational interviewing and OARS. So this might be familiar. If not, we'll be going over some of these questions in just how do we use these in the context of trying some food exposures. So again, whether you're working with those clients in recovery from an eating disorder or we're in the GI space or autoimmune space, it's so helpful to have that conversation. What are the food rules that are still in place? What do they look like? What is currently being avoided? Potentially food patterns, behaviors, certain prep tools, cooking methods, potentially even eating locations, and what has yet to be explored. There are so many things that potentially a client has never tried because they just didn't even know you could. I always use the example, this is so embarrassing, but until I got into college, I didn't know that you could cook soup. I thought soup magically, like it came through the canning process and you could only eat soup if it came out of a can because I'd never seen anybody like cook soup before in a pot. So I literally thought that the way we made soup was like through the canning process. And then I got to learn how somebody taught me how to make soup in college, and it completely changed my whole approach to cooking and preparing food. And now I am known in this household as the soup whisperer because I make so much good soup. So sometimes people just don't have a clue, and that's okay. And we get to enjoy finding that out alongside the client. And then using that collaborative approach, which is one of the 6 principles of trauma-informed care. So we've made this list of what's being avoided. Let's rank these foods using a SUD scale. And we're going to go over that on the next slide, on a scale of 1 through 10. And when they select, 1 is I can kind of handle doing this. I think it's not so scary. 10 is, wow, this feels really, really scary. When they say this feels like it's at a 5 for me, you can always ask, what made you select 5 instead of 6 for this food item? Or what made you select 5 instead of 4 for this item? That is such an interesting conversation. And especially for your clients who do like numbers. And we're trying to potentially shift more into body attunement and cues and sensing those body cues. When we talk about distress and rating distress in association with a food or a cooking technique, and they rate it at a certain number out of 10, we can talk about why'd you choose that number instead of this number. And that can be really interesting and open up the conversation, and you can get some nice pearls to understand more about what's going on about the story about that food. Also asking them, when you think about this food and how this food, think the thought of trying this food, eating this food, or this new cooking technique, how does that make your body feel? What's happening in your body when you start thinking about that? And then once you start seeing some of the lower ranked foods, what might be some of those foods that they're rating lower as like a little bit more accessible to try that we might want to try to explore together. So this is an example of a SUD scale, which is subjective units of distress, which a mental health researcher and professional came up with in the late 60s, and it's been used ever since and kind of evolved over time. And sometimes I'll visually show this to a client. Sometimes we'll have them create their own, and we'll just kind of give them the thermometer, or we'll use like sad face to happy face. It kind of depends on who's the client, what kind of visual do you think they're going to connect with, and they can kind of describe what a 0 through 10 feels like for them. And so going through and when we're talking about like what are some of the fear foods left, or some of the foods that you feel like still just feel a little too scary to try, where would you rate them on a scale of 0 through 10 in terms of how much distress you feel like they cause? So as an example, a common fear food both I think for the clients in recovery from an eating disorder as well as your GI clients, is peanut butter. That's a very common fear food for a lot of reasons. And I would imagine you probably also have your own food thoughts about peanut butter if you grew up anywhere close to the 80s and 90s. I think everybody was told like it was high in calories, it was too much fat. That was the days of like everything being fat free. And so peanut butter is such a common fear food. It's also just texture wise, it's really sticky. And sometimes that can, potentially for some clients with texture sensitivities, especially neurodivergent clients, sometimes peanut butter can be one of those foods that isn't necessarily super comfortable, but sometimes we are really into those kinds of foods. It really depends on the client. So we would go through the process in session, having this conversation with the client about, we've identified the fear food, we've rated it, the client rates it at a 5 out of 10. We've identified, through conversation using those open-ended questions and reflections, what are some of the emotions that come up for the client when they think specifically about this food. So when they're thinking about peanut butter, what comes up for them? Anxiety, fear, judgment, shame, especially around those who have kind of that like low fat backstory. Those are some common things that can come up. And then I do think that anticipated physical sensation kind of conversation is really helpful. Like when they imagine themselves trying peanut butter, what do they think happens to their body? What do they notice happens to their body when they start thinking about it? And that way, if they notice when they're not thinking about peanut butter, their chest feels neutral, but when they start thinking about peanut butter, their chest feels heavy. How can we maybe bring some attention towards the chest or towards the breath to see if we can work on potentially regulating that and helping the client feel a little bit more grounded and safer in their body? And temperature notes. I think also it's always really helpful to talk through, okay, if we're going to even think about trying this food, what feels safer? Do you want to have the food cold or warm or hot? Because that really changes how food is going to feel. And so identifying, even if it doesn't make sense to you as a clinician, it's what's important to the client. And often cold is usually a lot safer for folks, especially with peanut butter. And then if we're going to have it with something else, what feels the safest and what feels the most challenging? This is where it really transitions to how we're going to bring it into that clean life, because then we're going to be able to search using these foods. A lot of times clients feel safer trying something like peanut butter on a vegetable. Just because a vegetable has like less of the anxiety, fear, judgment, shame attached to it, then maybe some fruit, then maybe incorporating like a dressing or a sauce on a salad. And then usually the challenge, the mountain, is having it on a bagel, right? So something that potentially has a little bit more of like the diet culture stress values, morality kind of attached to it, which we've been working on hopefully with intuitive eating during this time. And then we're also going to do a similar process when we're talking about food shopping and meal prep barriers. We want to go through, these are 4 of the 6 principles of trauma-informed care: safety, curiosity, cultural, historical, and voice and choice. And these are some questions that we can ask the client when we are trying to use a trauma-informed approach to start transitioning to building some meal prep skills. So asking the client, what feels safe for us to explore when we start talking about preparing foods? Ask them. And what might be a barrier that I can honor as your clinician, a financial barrier, a mobility barrier, that we need to make sure is being honored when we approach this process. Embracing curiosity so that we're not being prescriptive from the get-go, and that the client can then really engage with, here's what I like, here's what I'm afraid of, here's what I'm curious about. And then I love understanding more about what meal prep looked like in a client's family household growing up, or potentially at different points in their kind of like immediate family unit, whether it's roommates, friends, and then how do they want the process of preparing meals to serve them? Like, what does that mean to them? If they could paint a picture of them being able to cook when they want to in a way that feels supportive, what does that do how to their day? How does that change their day? So doing some future work for them, I think, can be really helpful, because then we're not stressed about how do we chop a bell pepper. We're like, you chop the bell pepper, we figured it out, you don't have to worry about that part. So what does your day look like when you've done that? And we'll get there, we'll get to the bell pepper part. And I think it's always important to not be shy of what's the worst thing that can happen as a question, as a clinician. We want their honest, truthful answer. We want to know what that kind of like bird on the shoulder that's like, you're gonna screw it up, is saying to them, because we need to understand that. And understanding just what do we might want to try in terms of in session, whether you're working virtually or in person with a client. I love doing cooking exposures with clients where we go onto the meal planning software, we pick out a recipe to try, and then we both shop for the ingredients, and they're in their kitchen at home, I'm in my kitchen, and we're cooking together. And it's so fun, and also they just build self-efficacy, and then it becomes a recipe that they can incorporate into their routine. And truly mapping out what's the worst thing that could possibly happen, which is why I picked a picture of food on fire, because sometimes things happen and that's okay. And so we're trying to help them build ease with these cooking techniques. One of my favorites is sheet pan meals, because it's so easy, and I love in That Clean Life that there's the one pan meal filter that you can choose, and the tag, and it makes it so easy to put these collections together for this population, especially if they're into the sheet pan meal approach. And then of course you're going to talk through grocery and ingredient shopping, like what stores are they going to, are they going to go in person, get delivery, all that kind of stuff. So a very common fear is making and eating salad dressing. And I actually had a client who was very particular. She was in recovery. At first, she was originally diagnosed with binge eating, but it really was what the root of that was actually restriction. And so she actually had anorexia with binge tendencies. So with her, a lot of food rules, a lot of food rules. Also, she was a super taster, so she had a very refined palate and had strong preferences for certain salad dressings, and had this particular dressing that she loved from this particular restaurant, where she could have it there because it felt like having the dressing at this particular restaurant made it worth spending the calories, because she knew it was going to taste good. Lots of complexities there, which we could get into in a whole nother webinar. But when we're talking about doing food exposures and cooking exposures, dressing, we finally got to the point where we were ready to dive in. And so we spent some time curating dressing recipes and preparing what we were going to try it on together, and how trying that would make her feel and what it would do to her body. And we also talked through that during the actual exposure. It was interesting. She felt like warmer dressings felt really safe for some reason, which that's an example of, I was surprised, because that's not what I would personally pick as myself, but it's so helpful to have the client guide this whole process. And she also felt like she was more comfortable with trying the dressing on cooked food first rather than raw food. So always helpful to talk through all of that with the client. So now thinking back to those barriers, those sticky points that we can get to, some of the processes that we'll bring to them is we'll do in-session meal exposures. We'll come up collaboratively with the client some homework where they can continue to explore the fear foods or the fear of kind of like cooking techniques, and start to build a little bit more distress tolerance with those foods and cooking techniques. And we'll do some in-session and potentially homework cooking practice. You'll decide ahead of time, before our next session, will we be eating, cooking, or doing both things? Sometimes we want to start with a known food, a food that they eat regularly. That feels very safe. So sometimes a client knows, okay, I can handle this particular type of cracker, and I just want to practice eating crackers together. We're going to start there. We're going to start there, and then we'll figure out where we go from there. There are ways to check in with the client during the process. You can do a body scan starting at the toes or starting at the head and going through the body, What are you noticing? What has changed with your breath? Have you noticed any temperature changes in your body? Have you noticed any tension changes in your body? And working your way through the body, as well as that SUD scale, which we previously took a look at, the hunger fullness scale, which is on a future slide, which comes out of intuitive eating, and the I Eat script, which is from intuitive eating as well. If any of you have that book or the workbook, the I Eat script can be particularly helpful. And so you can always ask the client, and this is how we also keep it in scope of practice as a nutrition provider, what skills or coping tools would be helpful for you to utilize? Because hopefully they're working on that with potentially their therapist. And so if you're looking for any of these resources, I have most of these in slides, as well as the I Eat script, which is located in the book Intuitive Eating right here. So a hunger fullness scale, again, great for your folks who love numbers, but we're trying to get them to work on body attunement and interoceptive awareness. And sometimes clients might decide to choose different words, but essentially on a scale of 1 through 10, 1 being we're really starving, we're super hungry, and 10 being very, very stuffed to the point where it's physically uncomfortable. And sometimes using this can be really helpful for clients. I'm just also going to say sometimes for some clients, this is getting back into numbers too much. And so we might just want to use colors, or we might want to use physical sensations. Another example of being client-centered. We don't want the process of body attunement or intuitive eating to turn into its own new kind of diet or thing that the client becomes fixated on and they have to do it right. We want permission to burn the rice in the whole process. So checking in as you're trying the peanut butter or trying the dressing or trying the cooking practice together, how are you feeling on a scale of 1 through 10 in terms of 1 being super, super hungry, 10 being super full? Where are you right now? This can be a nice way for clients to check in. Sometimes when we do this too soon in the recovery process, even with those GI clients, it's really hard for them to tell. It's physically really challenging. And sometimes clients don't have those physical cues, and that's okay. I kind of say that we leave the door open for these cues to someday show up potentially with a little bit more ease, and sometimes it's not going to happen. And so it's always okay. We have to demonstrate that flexibility as ourselves with our clients. So some tools that we can use while we're looking at these practices, planning and eating or cooking together, that's going to happen in session. And if you do use Practice Better, they make it so easy because they have the video incorporated right into, if you're doing telehealth sessions, you can do it right there. I've literally been in a Practice Better session with my computer open in my kitchen, and we've chopped things together and cooked tofu, and it's been really fun. And I've done that both with adults and with teens. And if you're thinking, gosh, this could never work with teens, it really can. They love building self-efficacy because you're not their parent telling them what to do. And obviously sometimes teens are going to be a little prickly, and we have a lot of those sessions where all we do is see the ceiling and get one-word answers. But when they're at that stage where they're curious about, okay, I'm ready to have some autonomy. I want autonomy. Most teens want autonomy. And doing this kind of work with a teen can really help them grow towards that autonomy. And they usually really like that. And then building the recipe and ingredient lists that you might work on together in session, or they might have as homework, we're going to use that Clean Life for. And then you can build protocols in Practice Better that then have the recipe packets incorporated into, as well as the shopping lists, and you can save those and you can reuse them for other clients. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you do a cooking rice exposure. And I have a screenshot of one of those. So I think I try to check in, how often do I take for granted the things that I know how to do when it comes to food. I think that comes to, I don't know about all of you, but I think throughout this career, we always have a sprinkle of that imposter syndrome of like, I don't know enough. I need to learn more biochemistry. I need to know more about this. I need to know how to use this lab or all this stuff. And sometimes the client really just needs someone to hold space for them while they learn how to steam rice, and that's okay. And so you can build a protocol in Practice Better that's all about a cooking technique. So you can build a protocol that's about cooking one food, a basic food, how to steam something, um, a, a, a sheet pan meal recipe protocol is also something that is really helpful. The concept of how big is the sheet pan? Where do you get it? If you can't afford to buy one, where are places you might be able to get one? And in terms of building these protocols, it can be so helpful to have them on hand so that the client also knows, oh, there's nothing wrong with me that I don't know how to do this thing that I perceive everyone knows how to do. It's a common thing that people need help with. And then you can attach recipes, you include a link to recipes. We also include video links in these protocols because you can in Practice Better, which is so nice, where you can put in like a YouTube link or any kind of link, and the video will be in the protocol so the client can see somebody chopping a bell pepper. And that can be so helpful for the clients. So now let's get to the really fun part. We're going to do some demos. So we're going to build some exposure packets together. We were talking about peanut butter earlier, so I'm going to show you an example of that one. We also built a hummus one. But before we jump into that, I'm curious if anybody has a common client food fear that you would love to build an exposure packet together for today. Anybody think of one? Pasta! Starches. Yeah. Okay, awesome. We're going to go with pasta starches. Fish is a good one too. Oh my gosh. And tofu. See, this is amazing because all these foods that we potentially know how wonderful they are. They can still have such deep story behind them for a client. Yeah, nuts and seeds for sure. Oils in general. Oh my gosh. Okay, so we're gonna stop screen sharing here and we're gonna screen share that Clean Life. So I wanted to give you a sneak peek as to when I build a recipe packet, what that might look like with the client. So we'll do peanut butter first, and then we'll jump in to do pasta starches because I love that idea. So when I'm with a client, I will have that conversation that was detailed in the other slides, and then I will open up that Clean Life and I will screen share it with the client. And that gives them a visual because they can get excited about pictures sometimes. I will ask for permission before I do that. That is something that's actually really key. Is it okay if I screen share pictures of food? Is it okay if we do some screen share for you to select what recipes feel comfortable to you? And most of the time, the clients are okay with it. And sometimes it's not a good fit. It's not going to be supportive of the recovery, and that's okay too. And we can just build something for them. So always a good idea to check in with the client. So we'll put in peanut butter and we'll search. So look at all these gorgeous, delicious recipes. I just had some food, so I'm really glad I ate because this is always the worst. I don't know about the rest of you. When it's the end of my day and I'm waiting for dinner and I'm like trying to build my last recipe book or meal plan at the end of the day, I'm like, I shouldn't be doing this right now. I'm so hungry. It's so hard. Okay, so with this, what we might do, this can feel really overwhelming to a client. So we can go in here and we can bring the ingredients down to 2 ingredients and see what we get. So now we're getting some suggestions for peanut butter and one other thing. And we've already talked to the client about what might feel like the safe one other thing. And so some of these are a little scary, right? We've got kind of our mountain here with the bagels and potentially with the toast. But at first, it might feel safer for a client to try peanut butter, potentially with an apple, or potentially with banana or with celery. And so if we're building an exposure packet of what we're planning on having together in session, to kick things off, I would ask the client of these things what feels safe to them. I'm not going to guide them to these things. I'm going to ask them by just showing them the pictures. And then they can say, you know what, I think the apple with peanut butter feels safe. And so we can add it to our peanut butter challenge plan. And I'm kind of putting my beginning ingredients in the breakfast category, even though we're not really building a meal plan here. This is how I kind of build a in order recipe packet. We add a recipe there, and we would go through, and then once we decide we've been able to get past the 2-ingredient peanut butter challenge, we can increase the ingredients, and slowly over time, potentially with in-session challenges, or potentially if they feel comfortable as homework, we can work our way up to more ingredients. We would do that over time. Speaking of time, I'm checking time. And we would build a little plan. And so we build a couple of few ingredient challenges to maybe kick off with. Something that I felt sometimes this kind of starts encroaching a little bit into diet land, but it does get the client to try the food. Sometimes when you combine like a fear food with something that's high in protein, that can make the client feel a little bit more comfortable trying the food, like the yogurt, the Greek yogurt and peanut butter on the rice cake. Sometimes that feels really safe to try when it's mixed with peanut butter that way. And then I think it's really helpful to either as homework or in session cook together something that incorporates the fear food as something that flavors a food item. So I pulled two. This is an example of a recipe that clients really love. This one is so good. If you haven't tried this one, also just gonna plug that this recipe is delicious and super easy to make. And because they barely have to chop anything, you can literally get almost all of this already pre-cut or frozen and thawed at the grocery store. This is a great example of a recipe that if you've got a client who has not had a lot of experience of preparing food for themselves, you, at least in our grocery stores, you can get pre-cut red cabbage here, and everything else is frozen, and you're literally just tossing it, thawing and tossing it together, and it's so simple. And so this could be a lovely, if you've got a half-hour session with a client where you're doing a cooking exposure, this is a great one to try. And then they get to try the fear food, the cooking ingredient of peanuts and peanut butter. So that's an example of what one might look like, but let's build one together. So we're going to reset our filter, and we're going to do pasta. And so as we kick off, look at all these gorgeous recipes, so many things to try. Again, it might feel like a little bit of a lot. So we're going to then go in and toggle down the ingredients. I don't know if you can make pasta with fewer ingredients, but we're pretty close. Okay, so we've got some nice simple pasta recipes here. Orzo is really lovely also because it kind of looks like rice, and sometimes that makes clients feel a little bit safer about trying it too. So maybe we'll check out trying the orzo first. Also pretty easy to cook, and it cooks pretty quickly. And we're gonna make a new plan. Pasta challenge. This is also just a little moment thing. I might ask the client, what do you want me to call this? What word do you want to use? And then we'll go with the word that they like. And because this is a nice, simple, like 2-ingredient thing, I'm just going to stick it in breakfast to kick us off, because when you export the PDF of the recipes, it will be at the very beginning of the PDF. And so the client isn't getting a recipe PDF that has like 27 ingredients at the very top, which can feel a little overwhelming. It's starting in a very gentle way. And then we'll take a look. We'll go back over here with the client and ask them, like, if you think about pasta, what might make it feel more comfortable to eat? Do you want to have it with something that has other nutritional components to it that feels a little bit more accessible or safe, or anything flavor-wise you're interested in trying? And a lot of times they will love the idea of having something really starchy with a high protein. That just like the math starts to math a little bit there. We'll still spend some time talking about, tell me about why and where that's coming from. And so maybe they really like chicken. I'm going to just skew this back up and we're going to add chicken breast. And now we've got some recipes that have chicken breast incorporated into them that also are going to probably taste really good because all of these tend to taste really good. And if we want to keep it really, really nice and simple, we can kind of look at these together. We just tried the orzo, so they might be open to trying like a chicken orzo. We'd throw that into our pasta challenge kind of in the next spot there and save it. And we go through and just see if anything else look good to you. You know, maybe we try this together in session and then we come back to this list of foods and say, okay, we tried this together in session. What of these do you want to try on your own? Which one looks good to try on your own? And then I'll throw that into their recipe packet. This one looks pretty simple. So even the chickpea pasta we can throw in there. And I'm sure Avita can do a better job showing all the bazillion amazing ways that you can share this with your client. I tend to keep things really simple. And the important thing is that it's consistent for the client, that we're keeping things really consistent. So I tend to actually export the plan and I'll even have them pick what they want on the cover of the plan so that they're really involved in the whole process. And then one thing that we do is we make sure nutrition facts are turned off. And we don't include the plan because this is going to be a recipe packet. And sometimes I'll include the list if they're going to be cooking all the things, but usually we just do notes and a cover and then the wonderful recipes and start to export. And then we can put that into their practice better protocol. I wanted to show you a couple other examples of what some cooking challenges look like as well. So I'm gonna go back to see, these are all the wonderful plans that we've built over the years. So I have a client who is very new to preparing food for themselves. And they have pretty significant autoimmune condition, and we're working on some texture work and some eating behavior work. And we realized that she had never made tuna salad. So it was like the same thing as me with the soup. She had no idea that you could like make tuna salad. She thought it was something you could only buy at a deli. So we talked about how to make tuna salad, and we built this together looking at different tuna salad recipes that were appealing to her. And so what I did was I screen shared. We went through ingredients that felt safe, felt like they were things that she wanted to eat. And we were able to put together a recipe packet that had a bunch of different tuna salad recipes that she felt she wanted to try. Notice I'm not filling all the spots. It's okay. We don't have to fill all the spots for these clients. We can decide on a handful of recipes that the clients feel safe trying. And for her, she was particularly excited about things like the tuna stuffed pepper and the apple slices with tuna. Those were really appealing to her, and because they seem so simple and they seem so accessible. And so this was an example of we're going to try a new skill of making basically some kind of deli salad, which all she needed was the canned tuna. And we talked about picking out a mayo and what felt safe to her there, and then how to season it and other things that can go along with it. And we built this together by using the filters in session where we just looked at, I think it was canned tuna, or maybe it was tuna. It was just tuna. And we were able to get all these wonderful like recipes for her to choose from. And there's so many in here. It was really nice that we could just go through and select the things that looked appealing to her. She was super engaged, and she actually made this as she made one of them as homework, and she felt so good about herself being able to do that. And so that was such a big win for the client. And we now have a brand new food and a brand new cooking technique that the client's able to utilize at home, and hopefully and do that long term. So I wanted to just show some of those examples of don't be afraid of actually screen sharing. I'm going to show you one more actual real client packet that we built recently. Let me, hold on. What's something from an actual real session? Because this is from a real session, but I have a client who, this is not their real name, but this is what we built in one session, just 4 things. And this is what we did for a week. For this client, she had only had time to cook like 2 times that week. And she has a job where she's getting food at the job. And we just went through and we picked out, what do you have time for? What do you want to eat? What do you want to try? What do we have the spoons for this week in terms of trying things? And this is what we came up with. And she cooked all of these things because we only picked 4 things, and it was approachable and realistic. And I turned this into a beautiful little PDF booklet for her, sent it over to her in Practice Better, and they actually happened. And so sometimes keeping it small and manageable, we can have this impulse to build these giant, huge packets. And sometimes that's really helpful because people are like, I need to manage my household and cook all this food. And that can be awesome. But sometimes at the very beginning, we are just starting with a few things, and that's okay. So we're going to hop back into finishing up. Hopefully this works. It's going to make me do this again. So we looked at both the recipe packets for food exposures. We also looked at building some recipe packets just for starting to work on, let's try cooking some recipes at home as homework together. I love using the visual because it really helps ensure that the clients are truly actually, like, you're checking in with them, you're collaborating, you're getting their consent before adding a recipe to something, so that they're the ones who are saying, oh, that looks good, I want to do that. It's building autonomy. It's helping them connect to their food. So hopefully today we reviewed some trauma-informed, very incremental approaches while integrating that intuitive eating and recipe and meal planning. And we're going to hopefully help our clients just increase those cooking skills, embrace those trauma-informed care principles of curiosity and collaboration. And all of this will hopefully help your clients find more ease with food. And just a reminder, if you do want to learn more about some of these skills and tools as a clinician, we are enrolling for a September 2024 cohort for nested health coaching. This is exclusively for providers, for healthcare providers. You're learning us alongside healthcare providers, from graduate level trained certified coaches and instructors who are also healthcare providers. And so if you're interested in learning more of the coaching skills that truly make our job as a nutrition provider so much more easier and rewarding and purposeful, even if you're doing all the functional med stuff too, we want the client to actually engage and find autonomy just like those teens do. And so just wanted to include that, and references in case you're all interested in reading some of these wonderful references. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Evita, and we'll wrap up with some questions.
Yes. So if anyone hasn't heard of it yet or hasn't signed up, please register for our mental health masterclass series. This is a virtual pre-recorded series happening from May 28th to 31st online. You just have to register and you'll be delivered those sessions during this time frame. You also get access to bonuses from speakers, as well as a networking group. And the wonderful Allison will be a speaker at this series. Thanks so much for everyone for tuning in. Stick around if you can. We are going to head into the Q&A very soon.